Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. My name is Jeremy Holm, and as an 11th Airborne Division historian, it has been my privilege to interview some of our last living World War II era angels and troopers who served in Korea, Germany, and beyond. I treasure the long talks we have shared and hold dear the intimate stories they told me about their military service. One thing that every angel made abundantly clear was their deep love for this country, the United States of America. These angels definitely had pride in the airborne, but words fail to properly convey just how proud these old warriors were to be American. RHQ 511's First Lieutenant Foster Arnett, who was nearly killed during the fighting on Luzon in 1945, he shared the feelings of many angels when he said, "I'm a big fan of this country, I really am. I think we've got a lot of flaws, but generally speaking, we are the greatest nation in the history of the world." It is to these angels and their families that I would like to dedicate this 4th of July message. President John F. Kennedy once said, "The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it." When I look back at the history of the 11th Airborne, we could paraphrase the president and say, "The cost of freedom is always high, but the angels have always paid it." From World War II through today, the 11th Airborne Division Angels have left a legacy of service and sacrifice, including for many, the ultimate sacrifice. As President Ronald Reagan told the Angels in 1988, "Together you confronted danger and endured terrible hardships, and together you rose to the challenge. You never faltered. Many of your brothers gave their last full measure of devotion so that others might live in freedom. Your accomplishments in defense of liberty will never be forgotten, and America's debt to you will remain far more than we can ever repay." My fellow Americans, do we remember that debt? Do we remember the freedoms and rights that the angels fought and many of them died for? President Franklin Roosevelt once observed, "Those who have long enjoyed such privileges as we enjoy forget in time that men have died to win them." President Roosevelt said that on November 27, 1941, while declaring December 15th as Bill of Rights Day. I wonder how many Americans even know that we have a Bill of Rights Day, or can remember when the last time they read through that document was. But as President Roosevelt warned, it is easy to take our privileges as Americans for granted. And as President Reagan pointed out, we who benefit from the privileges associated with our freedoms owe the angels, and all who have served, a great debt, one that can never be repaid. The 4th of July is a time for us to consider that debt and to ponder the rights we have as Americans. Over 1,400,000 American men and women in uniform have made the ultimate sacrifice while defending freedom since the Revolutionary War began in 1775. Included in that number are several thousand 11th Airborne Angels who were killed in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and in more modern times with our Arctic Angels in Alaska. They were sons, fathers, and husbands who answered their nation's call and would never see home again. One of those fallen angels was medic Robert Lesher. On December 7, 1944, Private Murray Hale was hit in the shoulder by a Japanese sniper. Murray tried to tell Robert to stay back, that it was too dangerous, but the young medic was fearless. He crawled through the enemy fire, treated Murray's wound, then crawled out into the open to treat two more wounded Angels. And again, Murray told him it's too dangerous out there, but Robert persisted. He had casualties to treat. Sadly, medic Robert Lesher was killed by the same Japanese sniper while trying to aid his comrades. 4 days later, on December 11, 1944, the 187th Glider Infantry Regiment's Company F began their assault on what the Angels called Purple Heart Hill. Captain George Ory's men fought bravely, but the enemy's defenses were just too strong, so at 1600, the attack was called off and F Company returned to the lines at Enonak. Sergeant Celo Harrell, who had been hit in the stomach during the attack, he quietly asked Captain Ory, "Sir, did we do what you wanted?" Captain Ory looked down to see that the wounded sergeant had walked back to the lines with his intestines in his hands. Sergeant Harrell died shortly thereafter. On December 18, 1944, a column of Angels was hit by artillery fire and suffered over 50 casualties. One of those casualties was Sergeant Peter Cutt, who cried out for his wife Margie as a regimental surgeon amputated what was left of his leg right there with a trench knife. After another wounded officer was brought to the surgeons, an officer who was crying so loud that every Japanese soldier for miles could hear them, Peter told the medics, "Go ahead. Forget about me. Take care of that big crybaby." The Angels' battered column made its way to friendly lines, but despite their best efforts to stop the bleeding, Sergeant Peter Cutt died at 4 o'clock the next morning. Word of his death and how bravely he faced it was sent to his wife Margie, who was of course back home caring for their 19-month-old son. 3 weeks later, on February 5th, a group of Angels were hunkered down in a church basement during the battle for Manila, when a shell came rushing in and exploded. Shrapnel tore through the back of Private First Class Carl Bolas. His friend Kenneth Fuller rushed to help his wounded buddy, but there was little he could do. Ken, who would later become a pastor, would never forget holding Carl in his arms as the wounded Angel continued to cry out, "I'm dying. I'm dying." Carl's friends could only look on helplessly as he indeed died from his wounds. 5 days later, on February 10th, 1945, the 511th PIR's Company D was fighting near Nichols Field. Private First Class Larry McLean showed Sergeant Ed Sorensen his bloody hand, and Larry was from the South, so he said, "Look, Ed, I've been wounded." But the fighting was fierce, so Ed had to send Larry, who was a Silver Star recipient, with some blood plasma to go help Private Chester Smith, who had been hit seriously in a more forward position. So, exposing himself to incoming fire, Larry pulled Private Smith out of the foxhole and began to drag him back to safety, when suddenly Larry was hit in the chest and he collapsed, and he died shortly thereafter. After the action subsided, Ed Sorensen returned to the area, and a kind old Filipino man showed him where he had carefully buried Larry McLean under a cross made of 2 tree branches. Shovel in hand, Ed quietly surveyed the ground wherein lay his friend's mortal remains, and Ed later wrote that he thought to himself, "Where do I begin digging? Because Larry, I cannot bear pushing the shovel in your face." Decades later, this experience still brought tears to the tough old paratrooper's eyes. On August 11th, 1945, the 11th Airborne began their mad dash for Okinawa, where they would await permission to become the first Allied unit to land on Japan, and even the most battle-hardened Angel was hopeful that this meant the war was really over. At 1700, the Angels began loading into B-24 Liberators of the 22nd Bomb Group, and several took off successfully before the Angels waiting on the Lipa airstrips watched in horror as B-24M, Lady Luck, bounced her right wheel off an embankment and then crashed into a rice paddy. Fire enveloped the wreckage, and survivor Lieutenant Hoadley Ryan, he carried one wounded comrade to safety, and then he rushed back into the flames twice, despite attempts by Lady Luck's pilot and co-pilot to stop him. Lieutenant Ryan saved several fellow paratroopers and a handful of the aircrew before Lady Luck blew up nearly in his face. And with the war ending, this crash was a heartbreaking loss to the division and the families of 9 Angels who were killed in the crash. While he lay recovering from wounds received in combat, my grandfather, Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, he learned that his friends Walter Kennelly, Howard Mosher, and Joseph Signor had been killed aboard Lady Luck. Lieutenant Kennelly had actually been sitting in the bomber's nose and was trapped in the flames after the crash, and my grandpa said he wondered that if he had not been wounded and that he had been there, that if he would have been in the same plane as his friend and then died in the crash as well. Corporal Wilbur Wilcox later pointed out, Lieutenant Kennelly had enough points to go home from Manila, but he chose to go to Japan with us, a choice which cost him his life. After the outbreak of the Korean War, several of the 11th Airborne Division's units combined to form the famous 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. Prior to sailing for Japan, these Angels gathered at Camp Stoneman, California, where many of the troopers made their final phone calls home, and Sergeant Kenneth Stevenson of Rock Island, Illinois, was one of those troopers who stood in the long lines to make his call. Ken had enlisted in the Army in June of 1947, and he was promptly sent to the 11th Airborne in Japan. While he was at Camp Stoneman, this young Angel made sure to call his fiancée, Doris Edgar. And, the call, of course, had to have been brief because there was long lines, but I'm sure Ken reiterated his desire to get married as soon as he was discharged from the service and the war was over. But they would never have the chance. Sergeant Kenneth Stevenson was killed a few weeks later on September 27, 1950, at Kempo Airfield. He was 20 years old. 2 years later, on August 15, 1952, the 187th Company A found themselves dug in along North Korea's Kumwa Valley. A 6-man reconnaissance patrol was sent out, and they made it about 2 miles into enemy territory before 3 other troopers from the 674th Airborne Field Artillery Battalion watched the patrol come under attack by a massive force of Communist Chinese troops. The Rakkasan's patrol fought fiercely, but they soon found themselves in danger of being surrounded. So they continued a fighting withdrawal towards friendly lines, and the 674th's Lieutenant Walter Klepis, he heard Corporal Lester Hammond call over the radio, "I'm hit, they shot me in the leg." And that Lieutenant Klepis quickly gave firing orders shouting, "For God's sake, fire the battalion for effect." Again, these three forward observers from the 674th were watching this action. So 3 supporting batteries fired, and the Chinese troops found themselves under an intense barrage that left dozens dead and countless wounded. But still, the enemy pressed on, and within a short time, everyone in the 187th 6-man patrol was wounded. So the paratroopers pulled back through a ravine where they would seek some shelter, and there the others watched the painfully wounded Corporal Lester Hammond pick up his radio and limp to an exposed position where he began directing their supporting artillery fire. Corporal Hammond's voice came over the 674th's radio saying, "Keep firing. Your shells are landing right on them. I can see Chinese all over. There are many dead. You killed a lot. Keep firing." But the Chinese just kept coming, and Corporal Hammond adjusted the 674th's fire until Lieutenant Klepis could actually hear the rounds impacting close enough to the corporal's position that the explosions were heard over the radio headset. And then the radio went silent. Holding his breath, Lieutenant Klepis continued calling for fire when the corporal's voice came back on the radio. "Keep shooting. The Chinese are all over. I can see hundreds dead." Corporal Lester Hammond, his voice now weakened from blood loss, then called for one final adjustment in fire, one that gave Lieutenant Klepis pause. Lieutenant wrote, "My gut feeling said it would result in the shells falling on Corporal Hammond, and I told him so." His next words were to the effect, "Don't argue with me, Lieutenant. Shift fire. The Chinese will kill me or finish me off anyway." The battalion's batteries fired for effect, and the results devastated the enemy force. Lieutenant Klepis then called Hammond on the radio, but there was no response. When the 187th's Corporal William Leal crawled back to Lester Hammond's position to give him some water, he found the brave paratrooper was dead. Lester Hammond's courageous 2-hour stand had saved their lives. William Leal said it was clear to see that it was those danger-close rounds that had broken up the enemy's assault, while simultaneously taking Corporal Hammond's life. Lieutenant Klepis was a combat veteran who saw countless acts of bravery while serving in the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment during World War II, and he noted, "Hammond was willing to give up his life for the rest of his patrol members. He did this with deliberate forethought that he would die. I wish every American could have listened in to hear how a brave man dies." Lester Hammond was just 21. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The history of the 11th Airborne Division is full of such stories of courage, sacrifice, and loss. My grandfather, First Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, fought with the Angels on Leyte and Luzon. He said, "There is a feeling of closeness and love for your fellow men in combat that is different from any other feeling that you can have." I'll never forget sitting with Staff Sergeant James Wilson, a paratrooper in Company B of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Sergeant Wilson was a gentle giant, always quick with a laugh and a bright smile. But when he told me the story of the day his radio operator was killed on Luzon in 1945, Jim's big eyes welled up with tears. He said, "I couldn't save him. He was my best friend." The 11th Airborne's First Lieutenant Miles Gale noted with deep emotion, "It was very hard to wrap up a good friend and buddy in a poncho and bury him in a strange place." This is a photo of the 11th Airborne Division's temporary cemetery in the mountains of Leyte. Here, these young Americans buried their friends in ponchos in a strange place far from home. Yes, their commanders and chaplains did their best to hold moving services while in a combat zone, but the young paratroopers went back to the line thinking of their fallen buddy who they had trained with, shared a foxhole with, endured the hells of war with. In one way or another, they vowed to never forget their fallen brothers. When I think of the cost of our freedoms, I think of this photo and all the stories the Angels told me with tears in their eyes of buddies who were killed defending freedom. The 4th of July is a day to remember the right and privileges we have as Americans, and it is absolutely a day to enjoy those freedoms with our friends and loved ones. But I hope we all take at least one quiet moment to remember and honor all those who gave their tomorrows so that we can enjoy our todays. American cemeteries around the world are filled with the mortal remains of hundreds of thousands of those who, more than self, their country loved. Men and women who lived, who loved, who had hopes and dreams, yet were willing to put it all on the line for you and for me, who died in their youth so that we could grow old in peace. In the words of President James Garfield, "For love of country they accepted death, and thus resolved all doubts and made immortal their patriotism and their virtue." The 4th of July is a day to remember their sacrifices and to spend some time honoring the liberties they died to preserve. In the words of General Francis Walker, the 4th of July is not a day to mourn our dead soldiers, but to praise them. As General George Patton observed, we should thank God that such men and women lived. After all, can we really enjoy a day of freedom while forgetting those who died to keep us free? Each of us must answer that question for ourselves. For now, the gift of freedom is ours, whether we cherish it or not. It is a gift purchased by the blood of over 1 million men and women who believed that we and America as a whole were worth the cost. And as the great General John J. Blackjack Pershing once said, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds." My hope is that we never forget those who gave their tomorrows so that we can enjoy our todays. 11th Airborne Angel Kenneth Murphy warned us about such indifference. He said, "With the passing of time, it is so easy to forget those who sacrificed so much so future generations may be free to enjoy this great country, the United States of America. We must never forget." I pray that we will tell the stories of these great heroes, that we will think of them often, and live lives worthy of their sacrifices. We must do more than just remember. We must act to preserve the rights and freedoms that they put it all on the line to defend. That vision of America's heritage, for me at least, was begun by my ancestor, Captain James Barnett, who as a first lieutenant served under General George Washington and crossed the freezing river on December 26, 1776 to capture Trenton, New Jersey. Captain Barnett served from 1775 to the war's end in 1783, beginning a legacy of military service that spanned America's history through the Civil War, both my grandfathers in World War II, the 11th Airborne's Captain Charles Weddell in Korea, my father Jeff Holm in Vietnam, my uncle in Desert Storm, and so on. These great men taught me the value of freedom, and that as an American I have a personal responsibility to stand up for and to honor our rights and privileges. That's why I always considered it a great honor to wear the flag of the United States on our bobsled uniforms and to represent this great country in that sport. As a nation, we must never forget what it has cost to keep us free, nor can we afford to take our freedoms for granted. In the words of General Matthew Ridgway, today, as much as, if not more than ever before in our national existence, we need to stand up and hook up to meet with the paratroopers' calm courage, whatever bumps we may have to absorb. So this 4th of July, I encourage you to think of the angels and all the men and women who have served and sacrificed for the United States of America. We may not always see eye to eye, but may we never be found guilty of ingratitude and apathy. As Jack O'Connor, who served in the 11th Airborne Division in World War II, once prayed, "Dear Lord, I hope that this current generation of young Americans will someday be worthy of the generation of young people who saved my country and kept it free." Amen, trooper, amen. May we as individuals, as families, and as a nation remember those who kept us free and hold dear the precious freedoms we enjoy as Americans. Thank you for joining me today. Happy 4th of July, America.